Let's start with a word of prayer and then we'll get into Esther. Father in heaven, thank you for this time we have to come together and study your word. We thank you for this great book of Esther and just pray that I might be able to glean some good lessons for our lives from our study today. Be with those who are sick and struggling, our sister Pam and and Maria and just so many others dealing with sickness at this time. Continue to be with Amanda's family at the loss of her mother. Just pray that you bring them comfort and strength and that you might be honored through all of this. Father, we love you and we thank you for your many blessings. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, let's open up to Esther chapter 4. That's where we're going to spend our time today. We're still looking at this topic of God's providence, and you've heard me talk about just how there's a lot of turning points in this book. Esther chapter 4 is one of those, and one reason for this is because in this chapter we begin to read about a conversation that took place between Esther and Mordecai, and what Mordecai begins to do in this chapter is encourage Esther to intercede for God's people to prevent them from being destroyed as a result of the actions of Haman described in chapter 3. Now, if we remember what happened in Esther 3, is Haman convinces the king to issue a law that would result in the destruction of the Jews. So here in chapter 4, we read that Mordecai is mournful over the situation, and that results in Esther making efforts to care for Mordecai, and ultimately Mordecai asks her to intercede for their fellow Jews. And so one principle that can be gleaned from this chapter is the principle about interceding for God's people. There will be those occasions, more often than not, that we might be presented with the opportunity to intercede for God's people. Don, was your hand up?
No.
Okay, I thought I saw you.
It was, but it wasn't a question.
Okay. So with this idea of interceding for God's people, we're going to examine from this chapter more closely some principles about that aspect, interceding for God's people. So this section, though, begins in verses 1 through 3 is kind of the introductory part of this. So we'll just go ahead and jump in. It's Esther 4, verses 1 through 3. It says, when Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city and wailed loudly and bitterly. He went as far as the king's gate, for no one was to enter into the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. In each and every province where the command and decree of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay on sackcloth and ashes. So, what happens in verse 1? What does Mordecai do? I'm just looking at the text.
He mourns the pronouncement that they were all going to be killed.
Right. And what does he do? What's his outward action in doing that?
Sackcloth and ashes.
Sackcloth and ashes.
Standard for them to show mourning.
Absolutely, yeah. This was standard practice to show mourning. We looked at it in Job. It's something Job did when he had that tragedy come upon him that we looked at when we were studying that. And so he goes out in public. Everybody's seeing this go on. He's crying out loudly. He has this sense of bitterness about him. And so since that's true, in verse 2, we find that when he walked through the city, he went as far as the king's gate. And that's as far as he could go, because as the text says, no one was to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. So this king's gate, that's kind of one of the details that comes out in this verse. This would have been the entrance into the palace of the king, but because of the way Mordecai was dressed in his state of mourning, he couldn't go any further than that. He couldn't go into the palace area. Questions or comments up to this point?
I wonder who could anyway. I would think, and maybe this is not right, but I wonder who of the general population could go in there.
Well, I think the King's Gate was a little more public area that people could go in, but there was restrictions.
Courtyard, maybe?
Something similar. That'd probably be a good example of it. So, yeah, we could call it a courtyard.
Maybe it wasn't a courtyard, but an outer area where people could maybe come.
Yeah. So that's a good point. So the emphasis here is on the aspect of mourning, and this is what comes out in verse 3. Now, what's the overall response in verse 3 of the people, according to the text?
A very reasonable response is what it was.
Absolutely.
They did the same thing he did. They were mourning for that. I'd been shocked if they wouldn't have.
That's true. So this mourning is widespread. It's not just Mordecai that's doing the mourning. Every Jew across the Persian Empire was in a state of mourning. And it,
Just another comment.
go ahead.
I suspect it was more than the Jews, too.
That's possible.
Well,
That's
I'm
probable.
guessing the Jews had friends that weren't Jews.
Yeah,
Maybe not. Maybe not.
maybe. I don't.
I would suspect they did.
They might have. They might have gained some associations with other non-Jews. So what are they doing? According to the text, how is this mourning expressing itself? What's the text saying?
Fasting, weeping, and wailing.
Fasting.
Cloth and ashes.
Right, so they're doing a lot of the same things Mordecai is doing. So the picture being painted here is that the pain of this law was felt by Jews all across the Persian Empire. And so it's these things that set the stage for what we're going to be examining from the text of verses 4 through 17 of this chapter. Yes, we are going to work through the whole chapter, but again, we're not doing this in typical form. So we're going to look at 2 points about interceding for God's people, because this is what comes out in the text, this conversation between Esther and Mordecai about how Esther was being called to intercede for God's people. First point we'll consider from verses 4 through 8 is that we intercede for God's people by taking an interest in them. The second point we'll consider from verses 9 through 17 is that we intercede for God's people by planning for their salvation, and I'll explain those points as we get into the text. Now, again, we're looking at the aspect of God's providence. We'll apply those points to the concept of God's providence and see how it is God's providence that allows us for those opportunities to intercede for God's people. So we'll just take it a chunk at a time. We'll start with verses 4 through 8, if somebody wouldn't mind reading those verses. That's 4 through 8. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Matt. So, again, the point we're going to be looking at here is that we intercede for God's people by taking an interest in them, or we might say caring for them. So, in verse 4, what does Esther do for Mordecai? Sorry. In verse 4, what does Esther do for Mordecai? She wanted to give him clothes. She hears about the situation, and so she wanted to give him clothes. But also, another question we need to ask of this verse is, how's Esther responding to this when she hears about this coming annihilation of the Jews? She's scared. Text says she trembled. Matt's translation read with great fear. The American Standard says anguish. And so she feels this intense pain. And it's associated with the phrase great anguish or great fear. It's a phrase that has to do with feeling intense pain, sometimes associated with the pain a woman feels in the process of giving birth. That's that kind of language that's being used here. But it's applied to refer to the fact that great pain that Esther was feeling when she hears about Mordecai's situation. Dean, did you have something?
Yeah, mine says
Deeply distressed? Okay. So, yeah, that's the picture that's being painted. So, as was pointed out, the next thing she does is that she just gives Mordecai clothes. But how does Mordecai respond? He wouldn't take them. Now, we don't know specifically why, but from the overall context, he's still in this state of mourning. Anything else on verse 4? Well, she's just trying to help him in his immediate situation. Because from the opening verses here of chapter 4, we learned that for whatever reason, she hadn't yet gotten wind of what had happened about this decree. Sandy? It appears that way. So that's a good point, that she hadn't heard anything that was going on the outside. Well, she learns of the situation. That's where this fear is coming from. That's possible. But why else would she be afraid if when she hears about this situation? Well, he hasn't lost a loved one yet. Remember, he's responding to what's about to happen to the Jews. Now, what is Esther's identity? Okay, I see the point now. So yeah, all she knows is Esther knows Mordecai's in mourning. So yes, we go on into verse 5. She goes to find out why is Mordecai, her cousin slash uncle, who had taken her in. She goes to find out why he's in this state of mourning. But the text tells us that she sends this individual who is looking after her, because she had a lot of attendants, being the position that she was in. Now, with that in mind, we have to ask, why doesn't Esther go herself? Why does she send this individual? Now, a likely reason for that is because at this point in the story, it's not yet known that Esther herself is Jewish. Mordecai at some point told her, do not tell these people, especially the king, that you are a Jew. So that might be why she would send an individual, because she's not wanting to make it very public, her association with Mordecai.
I don't think she could have went personally anyway, by the way.
Why is that, Don?
I think they were probably cloistered. Because I'm almost certain she wasn't allowed to.
That's possible. She wouldn't have been allowed to. altogether. So,
I believe that's what it was.
all right. So that's a very good possibility. Anything else on verses 4 or 5? Okay. So going on into verse 6, the author of us records for us that at this point, Hathach went out to Mordecai to the city square in front of the gate. Pretty simple detail that this eunuch obeyed Esther's command and just went to the city square in front of the gate. This is why we can say that this king's gate was probably a public area. Now, the area, so this area outside the king's gate, from history we know that it was used as a marketplace. So again, a very public area. So it is at that location that verse 7 tells us that Mordecai began to tell Hathach, or however you pronounce his name. What does he tell him? In verse 7, what does he tell this Hathach? Tells him everything. And this is for the purpose of relaying it back to Esther. So this recalls what we've already read in chapter 3. Haman makes an agreement with the king that if the king issued this edict, Haman would pay 10,000 talents of silver, and this is millions of dollars in today's money. So but this was all for the purpose of informing Esther. Yeah, that is correct. So, but I was just equating it to how much that would be worth in today's money, because that's something we touched on last time. Anything else on verse 7? Okay. So what happens next in verse 8? What does the text say? That's it. So Esther, or Mordecai, hands this servant the copy of this decree, as some translation would say. Why? Why does he hand over a copy of this law or edict? Okay, that's true. But according to the text, why does to give it to Esther? Now, why does he want Esther to have it? And plead to the king. That's the point of emphasis in this verse. Mordecai hands over a copy of the edict, sends it to Esther, and this is where we begin to see that Mordecai wants Esther to do something about it. Now, one reason, it's not only that he wants Esther to, let me rephrase what I was saying. It's not only that he wants Esther to do this, but it's even deeper than that. The text uses these words, implore and plead. Now, what are you doing when you're imploring someone to do something or pleading with them? Brings begging to the fore. And that's it. So Mordecai is now going to begin to beg Esther to do something about this situation. And that's all why he hands over this copy of the text of the edict. But this all stems from Esther taking an interest in Mordecai's situation, this mourning that he's in. So the author of Esther is showing us that Esther took a great interest in what was going on in the lives of God, in the life of Mordecai first and foremost, but by extension, the Jews. And she would make efforts to care for Mordecai, but by extension, it would be an interest in the circumstances of what was about to happen to the Jews. But this brings forth the thought of interceding for God's people. Anything else on verses 4 through 8? They're God's people, number one, and they were very different from the world around them. It's the same principle today. A lot of people are against Christians because we don't fall in line with the world standards. So, does that answer your question, Dean? All right. Yeah, might be some jealousy there. Any other questions? All right. Go to verses 9 through 17, the second point. If somebody wouldn't mind reading those verses. Okay, thank you, Dean. So again, the point we're going to be looking at about interceding for God's people is that we intercede for them by planning for their salvation. So, verse 9 just introduces the section. Hathach came back and related Mordecai's words to Esther, just more of the conversation that's going on that builds on what was already said up to this point. So after speaking with Mordecai, given the words we just read, Hathach goes back to Esther and says, here's what Mordecai said. So, with that in mind, verses 10 and 11, we read Esther's reply to Mordecai. Now, when we read these verses, one thing that can be gleaned from Esther's reply to Mordecai is that it would be a very dangerous thing for Esther to go before the king without being summoned. Why? What is the first thing that's said there? They were killed. When you read Esther, the death penalty was there for almost everything. It's true. So, but that's besides the point. So, she says, any man or woman who comes to the king in the inner court who is not summoned has but one law, that he be put to death. But what's the exception to that? Unless the king holds up the scepter. Now, this golden scepter that the text mentions, it was a long, thin staff that would have been highly decorated. And if the king held this out, as the text says, they wouldn't be put to death even if they showed up unsummoned. But something else we should understand here is that this inner court was an area of the king's palace where someone could see the king while he sat on his throne. This was the throne room, we might say. So in Esther's reply, the picture is being painted that if she did as Mordecai was asking and came before the king without being asked to, she's putting her life in danger. Mordecai, he's asked her to go beg the king to reverse this law. But Esther's thinking, if I go do that without being asked, I'm putting my life in danger unless he holds this golden scepter out. Anything on verses 10 and 11? That's true. This was probably for the king's protection as well. Anything else before we get to verses 12 through 14? Okay. So Esther said what she said. Verses 12 through 14, Mordecai replies to Esther. Now, the first thing we see in these verses is that Mordecai's reply to Esther begins with a warning. What does he say there in verse 13? Exactly. Now again, it is not known yet at this point that Esther is a Jew. But Mordecai says that if they find out you're a Jew, you're not going to escape this edict. Don't think just because you're queen and you're in the palace and got it good that you're going to escape this edict. Now, as this functions as a reply to Esther's words, what Mordecai says here would mean that even though her life would be in danger by coming before the king unsummoned, he's saying here, your life is already in danger anyway, by virtue of the fact that you are a Jew. And so it only would be a matter of time before they find out you're a Jew, and you're going to get killed anyway. He's telling her, don't let this little law stop you, because you're a Jew anyway, and that's going to come out eventually. Questions or comments on verse 13? All right, verse 14, my favorite verse in Esther. And I'll tell you why here in a minute. Now, what does Mordecai say there in verse 14? Okay. Now, what does that mean? Exactly. Yeah, he always will. So, he's telling her, Esther, if you don't say anything, if you don't do anything about this, the Jews are going to be saved some other way. Why? Why would that be true? What does God always do for his people? He helps them. He takes care of them. Now, whether you realize it or not, God is always going to take care of you. Now, don't ask me what that looks like, but at the end of the day, God is always going to take care of you. Mordecai knew that. So he tells Esther, if you don't do anything to save us, God's going to bring it from some other place, some other person. Now, what's the question he asked her there? Okay, that's not the question he asked her. What's the question there at the end of verse 14? Okay, yeah, he says, and who knows whether you have not attained royalty for a time such as this. My mic's still going out. All right. Everyone hear me okay? So he asked that question, who knows whether you have not attained royalty for a time such as this? This question is why verse 14 is my favorite verse in Esther. Because he's asking her, you've been made queen, Esther. Maybe this salvation of the Jews is the very reason you were made queen. God's providence. There's a lot of application of that question to our circumstance today. I'm going to use the example that I've used at different times before. Maybe that first Sunday that I came to preach here when Mark was out of the country, maybe God brought me here to meet my wife. That's the question. Desiree and I both agree that it was God's providence that brought us together. When she tells the story, she'll tell you she wasn't supposed to be home that weekend, but God brought her here. That's what Mordecai is talking about. Esther, maybe this is the whole reason that you've become queen, to save God's people. Now, of course, it's God doing the saving, but he's working through Esther. So Mordecai says, make a choice. If you don't do anything about it, God will find some other person. Because God always takes care of his people. God is not stopped by laws that order the destruction of his people. Yeah, he did. He knew what kind of a God he served. And again, the application of that to us is that we have to remember what kind of a God we serve. He may not save us in this life from things, but he'll save us in the next. God always saves his people. Might happen in this life. Guarantee you it'll happen in the next life. Questions or comments? All right, that's your sermon from verse 14. I can make it longer, but we don't have time. So this brings us into verses 15 and 16. Esther's final reply to Mordecai. What does she want at this point? She's heard Mordecai's words. How does she respond? Wants for them to fast. Go assemble all the Jews. Get them together and fast. Who else is going to be participating in this fast, according to verse 16? The maidens, the attendants. Now, why does she want this done? Not everyone at once. Okay, what does the text say, though? That's when she goes to see the king. And just by way of review, what's the risk she's taking?
Well, she may be killed as a possibility, and she wants God to be with her.
Absolutely.
That's the bottom line, by the way. That's why she's requesting that they all do that, where God will hear all of their supplication, and all that's, anyway.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. She's risking her life. So she says, fast for me. Now, the text doesn't use the word, but prayer was also involved in fasting. One of the purposes of fasting was to sacrifice something physical to put your attention on God. It's still practiced today to some degree. So she's breaking the law. She's about to go into the king, risk her life, and she says, fast for me. Spend time praying for me. And she says there at the end of verse 16, if I perish, I perish. If that's what's about to happen, so be it. But fast for me. Pray for me. I'm putting my life at risk. And then verse 17, the chapter ends. Mordecai went away and did just as Esther had commanded. He follows the instructions, and the stage is set for what is going to transpire in the rest of the book. In other words, it's here that Esther and Mordecai, along with the rest of the Jews, will begin their work to prevent the destruction of the Jews. Also, and more importantly, it is in this verse that God, again, even his name is not mentioned, but his working is still there. He will begin to work powerfully through Esther to carry out the salvation of his people from people like Haman, who are seeking to destroy them. So the point we should see from verses 9 through 17 about interceding for God's people is that we intercede for God's people by planning for their salvation. Now the text shows us that Esther and Mordecai, they're beginning to make plans to save the Jews from certain destruction. So we also learn from these verses that they're putting their lives on the line in doing this. They're breaking the laws to do this. So since that's true, one thing we can assume from these verses is that Esther and Mordecai are applying the principle of obeying God over man. Sometimes obeying God means you break the laws of man. They felt this was their responsibility to God, to the Jews, to help save the Jews, even if it meant breaking the law. Now, with that in mind, what we should also understand from these verses is that interceding for God's people and planning for their salvation will require us to put our livelihoods at risk and do things that are contrary to what might be expected of us. So, this is all about interceding for God's people. And we do that by taking an interest in them and plan for their salvation. But those opportunities are brought through God's providence. Again, going back to verse 14. Verse 14 of this chapter is a verse that reminds us of the fact that our positions in life, whatever those positions are, they're opportunities for us to intercede for God's people in whatever way. Verse 14 shows us that wherever we are in life, we have an ability to do something for the people of God. And so we can use our positions, whatever those are, to do something that will bring honor to God. And based on what we read in Esther, one thing we can do to accomplish this is to care for others and to bring others into a saved relationship with God. Any other questions or comments? All right. Matt, would you close us in prayer?